Welcome back everybody with the Endgame course, and this game has been played versus a very talented former young teenager named Ari Gacy in Bill Festival in 2019. So 3 years ago. These days he is of course way much stronger, but this game is still instructive because what was played, the opening was the red T, and we have reached this position after some adventures. And on the first hand, the material is equal and the bishops look pretty much equal as well. However, there is a small difference in the position, and this difference is that black has absolutely horrible bishop on g6 and slightly weak king because my rook is cutting this king along the h file and the bishop takes away the escape square from the king. However, there is a very long way for white to from using this advantage in a decisive way. So this game will be instructive in seeing how you can use your opponent's mistakes to your advantage with the maximum effect. And the following move, bishop c3, is actually the beginning of a disastrous strategy for black. While the interest of black in exchanging the bishop on d4 is very strong, obviously this is a very strong piece, it leaves the defense of his king side very vulnerable. So after the trade, white wants to bring the king. The king has a pretty clear way of going. The king goes to the center, d4, and in addition, white is threatening to play g4, h4, and simply wants to trap the black bishop on g6. And if black intends to play f6 to save his bishop, then his central pawn chain becomes really weak. Now white has advantage, and black has to be a little bit careful with what he does. So he plays rook c7, he brings the rook to the 7th, and he plays f6, which is pretty normal. So black now intends to play bishop f7 and then followed by g5, simply get his king to g7 and protect everything. However, after rook d8, white makes intentions clear. If black now plays bishop f7, then white is going to play f5, and this pawn on d5 becomes really lonely and very hard to defend. For example, rook c5, and you can take, and then white king can go to e3, d4, and take part in the attack of this pawn, or white can play h4, and there are many ways for white to improve his position. So black decides to play f5 first, in ways that make sense, but simple king e3, and suddenly becomes clear that this pawn on e6 is more vulnerable than the actual pawn on d5, and there is not much black can do against white king's march to e5, where he will directly attack this pawn on e6. The difference in the kings becomes more and more pronounced. Black tries to limit the damage. He plays rook f7, denying my king chance to go to d4, because now he can take on g4, indirectly attacking the pawn on f4. So I play rook d6, the computer suggests g5 in this position, which is also a pretty awesome idea, followed with the h4, h5, and just pushing the g-pawn. But I felt that rook d6 is pretty straightforward, and after the trade, black is losing his pawn. So the only way for black to decide how. I think he played actually very reasonable. He played bishop f5, take, and the idea is if I take on d5, then black can play g5 and sort of minimize the damage. So again, you have to be pretty observant about what your opponent wants to do. And h4 is very accurate. It prevents g5. It is potentially a weakness, but preventing g5 is more important as it fixes the pawn on f5. And again, black is faced with unpleasant decisions. He decides to play rook e7, king f3, and h5. But the pawn on h5 is now admits that white 2 pawns on the king side, they hold the 3 pawns inactive. Black can no longer create a passed pawn, and that gives white a huge chance in the rook endgame. So we have reached this very unusual rook endgame. Usually you have 4 versus 3 on the same flank, and it's considered to be a draw. And if you play natural moves like e4 here, this is actually going to be a draw because of this. f5, g5, rook f5, and thanks to the famous rule where the king, the inferior side, the defending side king, is on the shorter side, leaves his rook on the longer side with the checks from the side, it is a draw. So that was sort of a trap, and I was lucky enough to see this trap, and I decided on this a little bit unusual idea is the rook uses the fact that the pawn on f4 is protecting this rook, and black cannot exchange this rook, but the rook on e5, thanks to the protection of the pawn, will be able to cut off black king from reaching the D file and use the D pawn, the pass pawn, as the winning instrument. So let's see how that works. Rook D7, and now king comes and just push the pawn. So black realizes this position is very likely lost, again thanks to his 3 pawns being held by white 2 pawns. And white has a simple plan of pushing the pawn together with the king, because with the D pawn, black has very limited chance to attack from the side, as the king will simply attack the rook and keep pushing the pawn. So rook A7, king D3, king F6. Again, it's nice to be able to play this position slow. The reason pawn moves to E3 is in case black decides to activate his rook, which he did in the game, and take the pawn, then the pawn on F4 will be protected. And just in case, again, this pawn also controls some squares. So black plays rook A1, D5, rook H1, and this position is already winning because white's pawn is way too far. Black has to bring the rook. And this is absolutely critical point now. If white doesn't find this winning move, the game is drawn. And the only winning move in this position is rook D5. And what it does, it prevents not only black rook from playing rook D1, attacking the pawn from behind, but this also prevents the idea of black king trying to block the D pawn. And the threat of the pawn quitting is winning the game. If white plays any other move, this is very likely to end up in a draw because his H pawn is quite advanced, and white rook on E5 is really badly placed to stop this pawn. However, after rook D5, white is just a little bit faster, and that becomes a critical factor in winning this game. So black gives me some checks, king here, and now rook C5, using the fact that, again, my pawn is closer to the promotion square than the H pawn, so black cannot trade the rooks. Instead, he plays rook D1, but now D7, using the fact that if black king now goes to E7, then you have check on E5 and potentially mate on E8. So he plays G5, he tries to do this, but after rook D5, again, black has to trade the rook, because if he gives the check, king goes to D6, and shoulders away the black king and pawn promotes, so he has to take on D5, king D5. There's only one move, king E7, to stop the pawn. And now a very calm move, king C6, with the threat of king C7, promoting the pawn with the check. And at this point, black resigns because his only move is king D8. But then white pawn on G5 queens first with the check, and that's why black resigned. So as we can see, you still have to be very, very accurate and sort of nurture those small advantages that you have. First, it was an advantage in the better structure, better bishop, better king. But then the threat of creating some pressure forces black to make some hard decisions, and he makes some mistakes. And then you have to be very patient to utilize those mistakes to the best of your ability. In this case, you transpose the game to the rook endgame with an extra pawn. And in the rook endgame also, the rook endgames are the most complicated endgames on earth in chess, and you have to be very careful. Sometimes, like for example, when white had a chance to play e4 instead of rook e5, this structure looks very aesthetic for white. You connect all your pawns, but it is wrong because it allows black to achieve some drawing mechanism. So rook e5, while it looks pretty ugly, to be honest, not aesthetic, but it is very effective. So beauty is a good guiding force, but you have to be playing chess very concretely and able to calculate lines, accurately to win the game. And in this case, I was also pretty lucky because my opponent clearly didn't defend to the best of his ability, but that's the lesson. So hopefully, again, you enjoyed this video, you learn how to utilize mistakes that your opponent makes and how to use them. Thank you very much for staying. Please leave a comment, and I will see you in the next